Welcome to studioW Faith Homeschool Group, and I'm really happy to have Sam with me, and I'm going to mess it up. Stephanie and not Caden, but Aiden. Yes. All right, and they're going to engage in a interactive conversation about Moses Yale Beach. They do have some of their school friends here, and they're in a different kind of a school, so we're kind of pretending we're having a school day out here at the studio. And when I do this with folks of all ages, and I say, what do you know about Moses Yale Beach? The first thing they tell me, and sometimes the only thing they tell me, is there's a school in Wallingford named Moses Yale Beach School. Now, none of you went there, but do you know where it is?
Yes.
Have you driven by Moses Yale Beach School? Do you know what street it's on by any chance?
It's on the street. It's on Main Street, right?
Mm-hmm.
The main
On the
street.
north side.
Yeah.
So why I'm asking you if you know where it is, because there's an interesting story about naming this school. It was named, I think, in around 1950s. Don't hold me to that. But there were newspaper articles that I've read that said the community was quite divided about naming the school. The land had been bequeathed by Moses Yale Beach to the community for philanthropic and educational purposes, and he was a supporter of education, even though he had no formal education himself. He went through a trades process and then emancipated himself. He was good with his hands. But he really believed in the value of education. And he bequeathed this land, and he didn't have an expectation that it would be named after him. This whole argument happened after he passed. But guess what? Many people in the community thought the school should be named for their convenience, so they'd remember where it was. Can anyone guess how they might remember where a school was and what they would name a school to remember where it was?
North Main Street School.
Absolutely. That was almost the winner. North Main Street School, because who's this guy, Moses Yale Beach, anyway? Oh, he gave us the land? Yeah, but he's dead. We don't know who he is. We want to know how to get to the school, where the school is. Let's do North Main Street. It was, people wrote letters to the editor. It became quite a little stir in town. And eventually, what did the school get named?
Moses Y. Beach.
There's rumor that there is a portrait of somebody in that school. And who do you think it would be a portrait of?
Moses Y. Beach.
Moses Y. Beach. So something of him, besides the name, is in that school. Again, the controversy was, who is this guy? Why do we care? Do any of you have any other knowledge of Moses Yale Beach in terms of who he was or why we might want to care?
He was a newspaper producer and printer fighting against yellow journalism, which was the false rumorization of certain topics. One of the biggest well-known is the sinking of the USS Maine in Cuba.
Interesting and full answer there. I will say that the printing part is really, really significant to Moses' story, and that producer is a newer term for things that we do with content. He was a publisher. So the publisher of a newspaper is typically someone who is financially invested in the paper. And they also can make themselves the editor. And the editor can have an opinion written in the paper. So they have those roles. There's different roles in a newspaper. And what other kinds of things need to happen with newspapers?
They have to be sold.
They have to be sold. So there was something very unique about this paper that he wrote. That we don't know the name of the paper yet, do we? Does anybody know what the name of the paper was?
The New York Sun.
The New York Sun, absolutely. And you know what's happening today? Like, literally, I had emails from the New York Sun today. There is a digital version of a newspaper called the New York Sun. And they claim to go back in history to What time period do you think it would be?
The 1800s.
The 1800s. So Moses was born in 1800. That's their claim, that they are restoring journalism back to that period of time. It's the mid-1800s. The Sun is the newspaper. He, as we said, was publisher, editor, but I also mentioned something about paper. The connection of Moses to paper is one of the strongest connections to how he was able to make the Sun one of the most distributed newspapers in the world at the time. There were three things. Paper was one, how it was sold was another, and how he got information for the content. Let's jump into paper first. Before Mr. Beach was in New York City, where the paper is published, he was in Saugerties, New York, upstate New York, and he got involved with a paper mill and the machinery to turn rags into paper. And some say that if he pursued that particular invention, that invention itself could have made him the millionaire that he wanted to be, that wealthy person that he wanted to be. Millionaire is not necessarily right. It's a good term, but wealthy is a better term. He aspired to be wealthy. That is a thread in his story. But the idea of having money, does that drive you to make decisions? Because that's what was happening with him. It was a value set that he had. How does somebody become so interested in being wealthy? Sometimes it's because you're poor and you want to aspire to something better. And so he was born in Wallingford in the 1800s, and he does have a distant connection to Yale University and does mention that connection in his own statement of himself in a book that was called Wealthy Citizens of New York, that was published in 1845. And he actually put himself into this directory of wealthy people at the time. And that directory of wealthy citizens of New York and various versions of wealthy citizens is actually nearly as famous as other things that he has done, like founding the Associated Press. But that's way down on the story list. It was like a little directory of people, like almost like a phone book. If you needed networking, he was kind of the innovator of networking in the mid-1800s. And he identified all these people, and he did these little paragraphs that were written about them, and he wrote his own story there. And that's where he makes his connection to Elijah Yale. And if you go on our website, you'll actually hear somebody reading that little description of himself and get a sense of who he was. And that is called learning about him from his own point of view. Now, because it was his own point of view, does that make it true?
Not always.
What does it make it?
His point of view.
It's his point of view. What he wants people to know and understand about him. So when we listen to him, listen to somebody voice over, as an actress might do, to his point of view, we learn about him. But we might not be learning the truth.
Or the full story.
Yes, because it's only a paragraph, so it's what he wants us to know. And he ends that little bit with a reference to his family. And that's another driving force in his story. We call it legacy. What you could leave to the next generation, what you can bequeath to potentially the world. And he had 11 children. They weren't all equally recognized by him, like that happens in families sometimes, especially if there's so many. But there were certain ones that he already was proud of, and he actually mentioned, and he involved his sons in the publishing business. And Moses Sperry Beach became the next editor of The Sun, the newspaper.
Do you know if he still has relatives in?
Finding his relatives has been kind of a journey, but yes, everybody who's pretty much with 11 children, There's a very high likelihood that there are more beaches around. Moses Sperry Beach and Alfred, they were both involved in the newspaper. They seemed to be very different. And at the time of his writing, he probably didn't know what the legacy was. He was proud of them and what they were doing, and he felt they were carrying on him. But they went down very different paths. His youngest child was William, and earlier today I showed you a cookie with a picture on it, and the picture was of
His house.
And people call it a
Mansion.
And why was it called a mansion?
It was bigger than most.
It was
houses.
huge. Yeah, it was huge. Do you think that building something that's that huge is part of trying to have a legacy? Leaving
Yes.
something behind? You
Yes.
think he'd be pretty disappointed that it's just a restaurant now?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah. So it was so big and so cumbersome and hard to take care of that ultimately, while he was first seeing it as his legacy because he worked with a very famous architect, Henry Austin, who did a lot of significant work in the New Haven area, and he actually had family members staying in the beach house for a period of time. According to someone who called herself a historian of Wallingford, Lavinia, she had a column in the 1960s and so forth in the Record Journal, and she self-proclaimed historian of Wallingford, and she talked about meeting a family member who was related to someone who stayed in the house. So that is how stories come forward, oral history to some degree. And so he thought that his home would outlive him for sure, and it was given to William. So there's a whole thread of stories that are connected to William that are quite fascinating. So the primary children that are mentioned the most are Moses Sperry, who actually became a good friend of Mark Twain. Anybody familiar with Mark Twain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Famous writer.
Famous writer. So you kind of know that guy. You know, he's famous, and so his son Moses Sperry Beach, started hanging out with famous people and people who had ideas and talked about ideas and shared ideas. So he went in the direction of ideas. Alfred, on the other hand, picked up something else from his dad. He liked to work with his hands. So Mr. Beach really started as a tradesman. He learned how to carve, and he went to Springfield, and he went to partnership and did some of the first advertising for a small business ever done in Springfield. And he was advertising in his chair-making company, and that chair-making company got involved in building the Wilson chair, which ended up becoming one of the most famous chairs in the history of chair-making.
That's cool.
Because it was simple and easy, but that back that had it was shaped similar to the back of your chairs, but it had spindles, and but that particular venture required him to work with his hands. So one child took the legacy idea of ideas, and the other of building and working with their hands forward. Alfred became the one who started the American Scientific Patent Office, which is pretty significant to America and the world history, right? Would you consider that a legacy?
Yes.
He left something pretty significant through Alfred. Another cool thing that Alfred did is the very first school in the Reconstruction era. So if you're studying history, when was the Reconstruction era? Does anybody over there in the fan club know? What period of time would Reconstruction happen? What was being reconstructed?
The South?
Does anyone agree with him? How many in the clubhouse over there agree that the South might have needed to be reconstructed? All hands in the air. Not all of you agree? Some of you agree? Okay, in the Reconstruction period, Alfred opened the first school in Savannah, Georgia, for people of color to be educated. So he took on that interest in education and the value of education forward from his dad. Mr. Beach, he sprinkled these little nuggets of values into his children in different ways to carry things forward. There's wealth and there's legacy. Something falls in between there in terms of a value. And that is tied to the paper being created and mass-produced and being able to be created well. But it also ties back to what Sam said about you got to sell it. You have to sell the paper. And these papers of this time had a special name. Has anyone ever heard of the penny press?
Yeah.
So,
Penny press. So the Sun was the penny press. So how did the penny press get sold? It would be sold by someone like you, Aiden. You know, what would you, to sell a paper in New York, you would put some papers under your arm and you'd go out and hawk them. And you'd hold one up and say, "The New York Sun, just a penny." Young people your age, predominantly boys, there were a few girls that put their hair up under hats, but predominantly boys were the sellers of the penny press. Would you think that the penny is the smallest coin that we deal with right now? And it makes it sound cheap, you know?
Yeah.
But at the time, there was such a thing as a half a penny, a half
Oh.
pence. So it wasn't like dirt cheap. You had to really want to buy a paper to spend the penny, because that was 2 half pences. And you could, do a lot with 2 half pences. So the penny press, well, based on what we know, based on our understanding of the world, penny is kind of like you see it on the ground and you might not even pick it up, right? But in those days, it had value because you were willing to give it up, but it wasn't the smallest piece of coin that you could use. Got that? So the penny press, Sam mentioned something about yellow journalism. After the penny press, yellow journalism became actually on fire. It happened big time. But the penny press of Mr. Beach's time had content that he thought might be interested to someone like you, Willow. What would you pick up a newspaper and read? Have you ever read a newspaper? Anybody in this room? Has anyone put their hands on a physical newspaper and read it?
yeah.
Okay.
That was-
And what do you find in that newspaper?
Local news, international news.
News? What else besides news? Is
Sailors.
there any illustration kind of stuff?
There are ads like at the back.
There are ads?
The old newspapers had the Sunday cartoon things.
I'm pretty sure they still have some. Certain newspapers still run cartoons.
Yeah, well, there's a whole cartoon page usually in serial cartoons. So there was print, and there were some images. He actually explored some of the early illustration kinds of things, but he also wanted you to come back and buy the paper again. So if you were looking for